Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes, and welcome to Gwen Aimlessly Chatters About Real Literature, also known as Books Might Add Think Who Has a PhD in English Literature Thinks I Should Read because reading them improves my understanding of good literature. So today's novel, and it is a novel, is a very big book. It is an extremely large book, and perhaps even excessively large book, and that is, as we can see here, Anthony Burgess's A Novel, Earthly Powers. Now, earthly powers is a lot of things. One of the things that my father told me, actually, before I started reading this, was that this novel, among other things, was Anthony Burgess's attempt to make a big book. You see, there are a lot of awards out there for art, for literature, for films, and it's a bit of a truism that there are certain kinds of works of art, film, books, what have you, that don't win awards. If you go to, I don't know, say the Oscars, you'll notice that there is an absolute preponderance of dramas over comedies that win awards, because people feel fundamentally that something that makes you rage or scream or cry is somehow better or more important than something that makes you laugh. That biting, trenchant commentary or just something that makes people be filled with joy is somehow insufficient to the purposes of creating great art. Among books, there is of course that particular bias, but another bias among those is the big book. That is, if you haven't written big literature, if you haven't written an enormous book, if you haven't written a book that is, as this particular book is, 605 pages long, and it's a very, very big, heavy lump of writing. If you haven't written a book like that, then you haven't written real literature. And so Anthony Burgess, at the outset of writing this, set out to write a book that would get him awards. He set out to write a book that was written... It was written for book awards committees. It was written to try to land things... to land the great literary awards of the world. And so, in some ways, this book reflects that. For one thing, this is a book that has a lot of $10 words in it. And it has a lot of not English in it. And, so, when he's writing in it, the very first sentence, designed to be shocking and attention-getting, is, "It was the afternoon of my 81st birthday, and I was in bed with my catamite when Ali announced that the Archbishop had come to see me." Now, I don't find catamite to be a particularly obscure word. C-A-T-A-M-I-T-E, if you're wondering. But catamite is, according to people who are not me, a somewhat obscure word, and a catamite is basically a young male sex slave. Catamites are normally boys who are used by older men for the purposes of having sex with, well, you know, boys. Since our protagonist and ostensible author of this book, Kenneth Toomey, is 81, his catamite is in fact in his respective 40s, I believe it is. But nonetheless, he is an 81-year-old sleeping with a much younger man. And yes, the lead character in this, the central character, is a gay man. The thing about this book is, one of the major themes in it, depressingly enough, is that this is the story of a man who has some of the worst some of the worst choices in boyfriends in the history of the universe. He's gay, and he's gay at the start of... this book starts somewhat in the middle. That is, the first chapter of this book is chronologically really only a month or two before the last chapter of this book, and after the first several chapters, the whole thing warps back in time to when the protagonist, to when Ken Toomey was in his 20s. And his 20s were during World War One. This book ends during the 60s, and the copyright to it is 1980. So you can tell that it was written at a particular... that having been written in 1980, you can tell that this is a book that is now nearly 40 years old. But the end of this book is set during the 60s, if I recall correctly. And the storyline of this book traces the whole of Ken Toomey's life from during World War One all the way back up to the relative present of this novel. And the story of it is basically, at the start of this book, he's 81, and he is asked by a visiting archbishop to please tell the story of a particular man he knows, a man who is going to be canonized, a former bishop who is going to be canonized, and because he supposedly saw that man perform a miracle back in, it was Chicago in the 1930s, I believe it is. And because he saw him perform that miracle back then, they're asking him to, as a faithful son of the Catholic Church, or somewhat faithful, eminently connected to, in any event, they've asked him to explain this story of this miracle. And this book then proceeds to tell the story of how Ken Toomey got to where he is, that he would be asked this. And as we discover, this particular miracle-working bishop was actually the brother of Ken Toomey's brother-in-law, because Domenico Campagnati married Ken Toomey's sister, Hortense. And Ken had this fascinating friendship with Carlo Campagnati for decades upon decades. They were friends and eminently brothers, and it's a fascinating relationship. And the thing about this book is, parts of this book are about religious faith in the Catholic Church in particular. But it's not really a book about faith. It's about the experience of being someone of faith, but who cannot genuinely have faith because Ken Toomey is gay. And his being gay has been declared by the Catholic Church to be fundamentally sinful, to be a sinful choice. But he's gay, and he knows that it's how he's built. It's not something that he's chosen to do. In fact, he says several times in the books that he really wishes it were otherwise, because he finds it really rather miserable. Something a friend of mine once pointed out rather sardonically, which is, what gay person would choose to be gay given the atmosphere around gay people? The thing about this book, and so this book talks about his experiences as a gay man in a world that doesn't accept gay people. It talks about his experiences of managing to over and over again find boyfriends who are the worst people ever. His first boyfriend in this book, Val Wrigley, is possibly one of the worst people ever. And he crops up again and again and again through this book, long after Val Wrigley broke up with him during the First World War because he wasn't giving Val enough monetary support to get his poetry published. Because goodness knows that's why you're in relationships with people. And so this book traces that. It traces those relationships. It traces just the path of his life and his sister's life and the troubles that he has and the people that he meets and loves and loses. And he's a very, very sentimental man. This is a book that has a lot of tears in it, because he is very sentimental. He is somebody who, once he gives his heart, and it turns out that the person he gave it to can't love him that way or just is a jerk, it kind of breaks him a little every time. And so these are all central themes, but I have to say, to me at least, one of the biggest central themes, once you get past his sentimental attachments to love, duty, and faith, is the fact that this is a book that is written by a writer who... Now, you know that I said Anthony Burgess was writing this for the purpose of winning awards, so it's a very writerly book. It's a book with the $10 words. It's a book... It's a book that if I try to find an exact sentence that is particularly pertinent to what I'm trying to describe, of course I'll never find one. But what happens... here we go. My old-fashioned in loco parental fears for Hortense's honor were, you will say, out of the future, which is your enlightened present, absurd as well as hypocritical. They were also, if Domenico were to be considered the sole candidate or ingrate for battering at that honor, proved, temporarily at least, I thought, needless by his receipt of a letter from Merlini in Milan. A letter I brought with his coffee the following morning, being up early to resume my moral watch. The whole book is written like that. The whole book is full of $10 words and complicated sentences and foreign phrases. There's a lot of Italian in this book, and French and German. And it's written by a writer who is writing for himself. This is a writer who, within the context of the book, the author that is Ken Toomey, stepping aside for a moment from Burgess's particular motivations, Ken Toomey, who is ostensibly writing these memoirs, is writing a book for himself. It's a book where he's not worrying about whether or not a popular audience can read it. He's not editing it for easy understanding. He's writing it for himself. A highly educated, highly literate, highly intelligent and well-read and genuinely brilliant person, and he's writing it for himself almost. And the book reflects that. It reflects this wordy, I don't care who's going to read this because I am writing this from my perspective, from my internal perspective, my occasionally forgetting as I write this that I could not have had Ali's gift of the cigarette lighter 38 years ago, because 38 years ago I hadn't met Ali yet. And the whole book is just complicated and difficult to read from a purely linguistic perspective. It is entertaining and sad, but mostly, in a lot of ways, mostly this book is just about writing. And That's all I've got to say, and thanks for coming, and I'll see you next week.